Constantinople, November 1899. A German engineer stands in the courtyard of the Sultan's palace, holding a leather folder. Inside are blueprints for a railway that will stretch from Berlin to Baghdad. We are told that World War I started because an archduke was shot. We are told it was a tragic accident of alliances, but that is a lie written for children. The Great War did not start with a bullet. It started with a balance sheet. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because of bad generals or weak soldiers. It fell because it was bankrupt, and the railway was the collateral. Think about what a railway meant in 1900. It was not just steel and steam. It was liquidity in motion. It was the ability to move goods, armies, and resources faster than your enemies. Speed is money, distance is cost. And Britain had built an empire on controlling both. The British did not rule the world with soldiers alone. They ruled it with shipping lanes, insurance contracts, and the Suez Canal. Every ton of cargo moving from Europe to Asia paid tribute to London. But a train does not need a canal. A train does not pay port fees. A train cannot be blockaded by a navy. And that is why the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was not just a construction project. It was a declaration of economic war. The Ottoman Empire in 1900 looked magnificent from a distance. It controlled 3 continents. It stretched from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts. The Sultan lived in a palace with gold fountains and gardens that smelled of jasmine. But beneath the silk robes and the marble columns, the empire was drowning. It was drowning in debt. By 1881, the Ottomans owed so much money to European banks that they could no longer pay even the interest. The empire declared bankruptcy, but you do not walk away from a debt to the British and French. Instead, the creditors moved in like vultures. They created something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. It was a board of European bankers who seized control of Ottoman tax revenues. Turkish farmers paid their taxes, and the money went straight to vaults in London and Paris. The Sultan had become a tenant in his own country. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was not a fool. He understood the trap he was in. He knew that every loan from Britain or France came with invisible chains. He needed money to build roads, railways, and telegraph lines. He needed infrastructure to hold his empire together. But he could not borrow from his creditors without giving them more control. He needed a third option. He needed Germany. Germany was the rising industrial titan of Europe. German factories were churning out steel faster than Britain. German scientists were leading the world in chemistry and engineering. But Germany had no empire. They had no colonies in Africa or Asia. They had no navy to rival the British. They were a giant locked inside the continent of Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, was obsessed with breaking free. He wanted Germany to have what Britain had: global reach, global markets, global power. In 1899, the Kaiser visited Constantinople. He met with the Sultan and made him an offer. Germany would finance the construction of a railway from Constantinople to Baghdad. It would be the longest railway in the world. It would cross mountains, deserts, and rivers. German engineers would design it. Deutsche Bank would fund it. And the Ottoman Empire would finally have a modern transportation system that did not depend on British ships. For the Sultan, it was salvation. For Germany, it was a backdoor into the heart of Asia. For Britain, it was a nightmare that had to be stopped at any cost. Let us talk about the geometry of power. Britain controlled the seas. They controlled the Suez Canal in Egypt. If you wanted to ship goods from Europe to India, you had to pass through British waters. You had to pay British fees. You had to follow British rules. But the Baghdad Railway would bypass all of that. A German merchant could load a train in Berlin with steel, chemicals, or weapons. That train would travel through Austria-Hungary, cross the Balkans, enter Ottoman territory, and roll all the way to the Persian Gulf. It would never see a British customs officer. It would never pay a pound sterling to the Royal Navy. It was a knife pointed at the jugular of the British Empire, and the British knew it. Construction began in 1903. German engineers blasted tunnels through the Taurus Mountains. They laid tracks across the Anatolian Plateau. Turkish laborers worked alongside German foremen. The railway crept eastward, kilometer by kilometer. As the tracks advanced, panic spread through the offices of Whitehall in London. British strategic planners pulled out maps and drew red lines. They calculated distances and travel times. They realized that if the railway reached Baghdad, German troops could be on the border of British India within weeks. German merchants could flood the markets of Bombay and Calcutta with cheap manufactured goods. British dominance in Asia would collapse. But there was something even more dangerous than trade. There was oil. In the early 1900s, the Royal Navy was converting its ships from coal to oil. Oil burned hotter and cleaner. It gave ships greater speed and longer range. Admiral John Fisher, the first Sea Lord, staked his reputation on this conversion. He said that the fleet must run on oil or die. But Britain had no oil fields of its own. They imported oil from Persia and the United States, and geologists were beginning to suspect that the land beneath Mesopotamia, the region we now call Iraq, was floating on an ocean of oil. The Baghdad Railway would cut straight through that region. Deutsche Bank had negotiated mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the tracks. If the railway was finished, Germany would control the oil that the British Navy needed to survive. That was unacceptable. The British deployed every weapon in their arsenal to stop the railway. First, they used diplomacy. They approached the Sheikh of Kuwait, a small territory at the southern end of the proposed route. Kuwait was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was weak and isolated. The British offered the Sheikh protection and money. In 1899, the Sheikh signed a secret agreement. He promised not to lease or sell any land to foreign powers without British permission. This agreement turned Kuwait into a British protectorate. It also cut off the Baghdad Railway from reaching the Persian Gulf. The railway now led to nowhere. It was a strategic castration disguised as diplomacy. Next, the British used the press. Newspapers in London began a propaganda campaign against the Ottoman Empire and Germany. They called the Ottomans barbaric and backward. They accused Germany of supporting tyranny. They painted the railway not as a tool of modernization, but as a weapon of oppression. Public opinion turned. British investors were warned to stay away from any project involving the railway. Then the British used finance. The City of London, the financial heart of the empire, refused to allow British capital into the railway project. They pressured French banks to do the same. They tried to starve the railway of money, but Deutsche Bank kept funding it. The Germans were committed. By 1914, the railway had reached southern Turkey. It was nearly complete. The threat was real. It is in this context that World War I must be understood. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 was the spark, but the kindling had been laid years earlier. The tensions between the great powers were not just about national pride or Balkan politics. They were about who would control the economic future of Eurasia. The Triple Entente, the alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, was formed specifically to encircle Germany. Russia feared that the railway would strengthen the Ottomans, whom they wanted to destroy. France feared German economic dominance. Britain feared for its empire. When the war began in August 1914, the British military did not focus solely on Europe. They looked at the Middle East. They looked at the unfinished railway. The tragedy for the Ottoman Empire was that they had tried to escape one trap and walked straight into another. They joined the war on Germany's side in November 1914. They believed that a German victory would free them from their debts to Britain and France. They believed the railway would bring German guns and ammunition to help them fight. But the railway was not finished. There were gaps in the tracks through the mountains. Supplies from Germany had to be unloaded, carried by truck or pack animal over mountain passes, and then reloaded onto trains on the other side. This bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort. If the railway had been completed 5 years earlier, the war might have ended very differently. The British wasted no time. In November 1914, just weeks after the Ottomans entered the war, a British expeditionary force landed at Basra in southern Iraq. Their stated mission was to protect the oil refinery at Abadan in Persia. But their real goal was to march north. They were following the path of the unfinished railway. They were moving to secure the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before the Germans could get there. The war in Mesopotamia was brutal. British soldiers died of heat stroke, dysentery, and cholera. The Ottomans fought fiercely. At the Siege of Kut in 1916, an entire British army was surrounded and forced to surrender. It was one of the worst defeats in British military history, but the British had unlimited resources. They poured more troops into the desert. The Ottomans were running on empty. Meanwhile, in 1916, 2 diplomats sat down in a quiet room in London. One was British, Sir Mark Sykes. The other was French, François-Georges Picot. They had a map of the Middle East in front of them. They took a pencil and drew lines. They did not consult the people who lived there. They did not care about tribal boundaries or religious communities. They were dividing the carcass of the Ottoman Empire before it was even dead. If you look closely at the Sykes-Picot Agreement, you will see that the borders they drew correspond almost perfectly to the proposed route of the Baghdad Railway and the known locations of oil. Britain claimed southern Iraq and the port of Haifa in Palestine. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving up the region to ensure that no single power could ever threaten their control again. The railway that was meant to unite the Middle East became the knife that divided it. The British also armed and encouraged Arab revolts against the Ottomans. A British officer named T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, led these revolts. He rode with Arab tribesmen and blew up sections of the railway. The Ottomans relied on those tracks to move troops and supplies. Every explosion weakened them further. Lawrence promised the Arabs independence if they fought for the British. But when the war ended, the Arabs did not get their freedom. They got British and French colonial rule. The betrayal was total. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was finished. The Sultan abdicated. The Caliphate was abolished. the empire was dissolved. The debts were not forgiven. They were restructured and passed on to the new nations carved out of the corpse. Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan inherited the financial slavery that had destroyed the empire. The British and French got the oil. They got the land. They got control of the railways and the pipelines. The Baghdad Railway was cut into pieces. Different sections were now in different countries. It never functioned as the unified trade route it was designed to be. The dream of a Silk Road made of steel was dead. But the destruction did not end in 1918. The ghost of that railway haunted the region for the rest of the century. After World War I, the British focused on building pipelines instead of railways. Pipelines were easier to control. They did not carry passengers or ideas. They carried only oil. The Iraq Petroleum Company was formed. It was a consortium of British, French, and American oil companies. They built a pipeline from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean coast. This pipeline followed almost the exact same route as the old railway. But this time the profits flowed exclusively to the west. The people of Iraq saw their wealth being pumped out of the ground and shipped away. Their infrastructure remained primitive. The dream of modernization was replaced by the reality of extraction. During World War II, the strategic logic of the railway returned. Nazi Germany once again looked to the east. Adolf Hitler dreamed of capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus and Iraq. German agents were sent to Baghdad to stir up rebellion against the British. They promised to finish what the Kaiser had started. The British once again invaded Iraq to secure the oil fields and the transport routes. History was repeating itself. The location of the battles changed slightly, but the prize remained the same. Control the corridor. Control the world. After World War II, the British Empire collapsed under the weight of its own debts. The United States stepped in to fill the void. The Americans inherited the British obsession with controlling the Middle East, but they used different tools. Instead of direct colonial rule, they used coups, alliances, and proxy wars. Turkey became a key NATO ally, not because of democracy, but because it sat on the most valuable real estate in the world. The choke point between East and West. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the new enemy. The UC feared that Soviet tanks could pour through the same mountain passes that the Baghdad Railway had traversed. The logic never changed. Only the names of the players. Fast forward to the 21st century. The parallels are terrifying. Today we have a new rising industrial power challenging the dominant naval empire. China is the new Germany. The United States is the new British Empire. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway. Just like Kaiser Wilhelm, the Chinese leadership realizes they are vulnerable at sea. The U.S. Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In the event of war, the U.S. could blockade China and starve its economy. So China is building massive infrastructure projects across Eurasia. High-speed rail lines, highways, and pipelines that connect China to Europe and the Middle East overland. Look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative. It looks almost exactly like the map of the Baghdad Railway, but on a vastly larger scale. And just like the British in 1900, the Americans are panicking. We see the same headlines. They call Chinese projects debt traps. They accuse China of supporting dictators. They try to block Chinese companies from buying ports and building telecommunications networks. The language has barely changed in 100 years. The strategic anxiety is identical. The story of the Baghdad Railway teaches us that when a declining empire feels threatened by infrastructure that could undermine its hegemony, it will lash out. It will use financial warfare, propaganda, and eventually military force to stop the connection from being made. The Middle East is once again the chessboard. The wars in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, the tensions with Iran, the instability in Turkey, all of these conflicts happen along the same fault lines where the rails were laid a century ago. It is not a coincidence. It is geography. It is economics. It is the eternal struggle for control of the routes that connect empires. The lesson of the Ottoman Empire is brutal. They thought they could play the great powers off against each other. They thought they could take German money to build their country while maintaining independence. But when you invite a superpower to build your critical infrastructure, you are not just buying steel and concrete. You are importing their geopolitical enemies. You are making your land a battlefield. Today, many developing nations stand where the Sultan once stood, desperate for growth, starved for infrastructure, and surrounded by predators offering help with strings attached. They need railways, ports, power plants. China arrives with blueprints and loans, fast and cheap. The West responds with warnings, sanctions, and pressure. These countries are not choosing sides. They are being chosen for. Infrastructure is never neutral. A road is not just concrete. A port is not just steel. Every rail line is a corridor of influence, every loan a claim on the future. Control the flow of trade, and you control the state. Sovereignty is solvency. When you cannot pay, you no longer decide. The Ottoman Empire learned that lesson when its debts became knives and its territory was carved apart and sold piece by piece. We are told today's Middle Eastern chaos is about religion, ancient grudges, or cultural failure. That is a comforting lie. Dig beneath the slogans and the sand, and you find rusted rails, the ghost of a German railway that threatened empires. Borders were not drawn to unite people. They were drawn to stop a train. Empires don't collapse in explosions. They collapse in spreadsheets. And if this sounds familiar, it should. The board is the same, only the pieces have changed. History is not written by those who fight wars, but by those who control debt. The books are being rewritten again, and the train is coming.